So I think this is to really celebrate two of the greatest novels of modern Hindi literature. And I think it's an extraordinary effort to have translated these things. And we have what I think is maybe an unusual journey, so that classics of Hindi, and this is also Hindi that's not just standard Hindi, but it's Bhojpuri inflected, Awadhi inflected. So one of the real challenges of such translation is all the registers, different registers of language. So I think this has really been extraordinary work of translation, and thank you for bringing these worlds alive for us. So maybe I can start with asking you about a more personal journey on how you came to translate these difficult and challenging works.
Well, it was by accident really. When I left school from after my 12th standard. I was a very rebellious student. I didn't want to study. And my parents said, get yourself a job, otherwise we're going to throw you out the house. And so I managed to get myself an admin job with the BBC in London. And I told them in my 12th standard I'd done French and German. I'd like to use my languages. So they sent me to the Hindi service. And in the Hindi service, I had a great time. It was during the emergency, at the end of the emergency, and I felt needed to learn what was being broadcast. So I started to learn Hindi in my lunch hours. And then my friend said, go and see where we came from. So I came to India and discovered it was much more interesting than the part of southeast England that I came from. And then, being Indians, they began to bully me and said, you can call yourself educated. You're 12th standard pass. For goodness sake, go and get yourself a degree. So I began to study Indian languages at university. And after I studied, I came back to India, and then I read for the first time Rag Darbari. Now, Rag Darbari is a book of which there is nothing comparable in the English language. And since then, I think I have basked in the reflected glory of having translated it, because it's a book which has stood the test of time. It is a classic. It has fans from all generations. We just finished actually celebrating 50 years of Rag Darbari, for which there have been seminars, cross-disciplinary seminars, not just in literature. We've been looking at history. We've been looking at economics. John Dress, the famous economist who works with Amartya Sen, he did actually an analysis of Rag Darbari and the village that he had worked in for so many years. And Mahmood Farooqi, who single-handedly has started the wonderful Dastan Goik tradition of storytelling, wrote a 2-hour Dastan inspired by Rag Darbari, which left us rolling in the aisles for 2 hours. And this has been a book which has been a play. It has been on television, and Bhimsen Joshi famously sang Rag Darbari for the signature tune for the television version many years ago, which starred Puri.
So, so I think to engage with language is to almost engage with the deepest level of a culture. So I think it's amazing. You started off at the with the most difficult of kind of books. So could you tell us? So for those who haven't read it, this is it again. But it's an extraordinary novel for its wit and its humor and its sort of sense of detachment, but also empathy for that world, for the kind of world that is in a way disappearing, rural North India, which is not in a way fashionable to talk about anymore. I mean, we're much more aligned to talking about a very cosmopolitan Bangalore, I suppose. So I think, can you tell us what for you the sort of what is a classic, to ask it in a very elementary way, yes.
I think a classic has to be very, in some deep way, true. Not just the characters, but what it says. In Rag Darbari is fundamentally true. It may have been written over 50 years ago. Things may have changed, but people recognize the truth in the characters and the truth of the themes. In one village, you get to know these really colorful people from one village who represent And I have to say that Srilal Shukla, the author, who's a wonderful chap, said to me before, I'm very well read in English literature, Sanskrit, Hindi, you name it. He said to me, if I had to write a similar book now, it would have to be something like Marquez. You know, things have got so much worse. But you take on the police, the judiciary, the political system, the bahubalis, you know, the levers of power, the cooperative system, the education system. Everything is taken and pilloried, and the whole sustained novel is in a sustained mood of high comedy, which I don't think had ever been done before in Hindi, and is very difficult to replicate. And started basically by a group of friends sitting around Srilal Shukla having a beer at lunchtime, and he writing smaller pieces, the sort of smaller pieces which were customary to write, and they saying, no, these would really work as a novel, and he took that on board, and he wrote the novel in the end. But it really hasn't entered in the imagination in a way very, very few books have.
May I request you to read some pages so that the audience gets a flavor?
Well, I'm just going to read a very small piece, if I can find the right bit. Hold on. Yeah. So the scene is this: the main figure, one of the main figures in the book is a chap called Rangnath, who's an educated person like we are in the cities, and goes to stay with his uncle Vedyanath, Vedyaji, who is the linchpin of village politics, though he doesn't quite really realize it. Vedyaji is not only a Brahmin, he is also a Ved, and his main teaching when it comes to medicine is for men to preserve their semen. And he has a lot of hangers-on, and Rangnath goes with some of them. He goes with Vedyaji's son Rupan, who fancies himself as a student leader, and Vedyaji's sidekick Jodhnath, who's on the run from the law, and Vedyaji's sidekick Sanicha, who generally wears striped underpants, and is Vedyaji's candidate for the local village council elections, because everybody knows that village council funds are the same as the funds of the Pradhan, and so everybody now wants to become Pradhan, and they decided to go to the local Mela. And Rangnath, being an educated chap, is thrilled to hear that the temple of the Devi dates from the Satyug, and quite astounded when he gets there and finds that it's no more than 75 years old. And so they enter the temple. Rangnath joined his hands and went right up to the main image. He took one look at it and was rooted to the spot. All that he had read about ancient sculptures suddenly seemed totally meaningless. He thought, if this is a statue of the goddess, what were the things I saw in Khajuraho, Bhubaneswar, and Ellora? Shutting his eyes again, he tried with all his might to forget all that he had learned. In his heart of hearts, he began to scream, help, help, my faith is being attacked by reason, help me. But when he opened his eyes, he felt that all his devotion had disappeared, and that he was being violently shaken by all the history he had learnt parrot fashion. The fact was that the iconography of the statue was somewhat novel. It wore a sort of military headgear, and beneath its neck was a broad and flat chest. The area below the chest was missing. Those who came to the temple not out of devotion, but out of academic curiosity born of reading books by historians writing in the English language, could only state that this was the statue of a soldier dating approximately to the 12th century. Whatever else you may say about our country's sculpture, you cannot criticize it on the grounds of any confusion over sex. Rangnath asked the priest, of which god is this an image? The priest was very busy. He shouted, get out some money and make an offering and you'll find out which god it is. Rangnath's curiosity led him to step forward and touch the statue's neck. The priest looked at him suspiciously and then said, like an educated man, "Touching the idol is forbidden." As soon, history is the greatest iconoclast. It now overwhelmed Rangnath and made him say, "What sort of darshan is this? This isn't even the statue of a goddess." As soon as they heard this, the three Ganjahas, that's the people from the village Shivpal Ganj, the three Ganjahas with Rangnath blenched. Several people gave a start and began to look in his direction. Then Rangnath explained to Rupan Babu like an assistant curator in a museum. "Don't you see? This is undoubtedly the statue of a soldier. Look, this is his helmet, and look here, this is a quiver sticking out at the back. And look, the chest is absolutely flat." Rangnath was unable to complete his description of the soldier's thorax because the priest leapt up and shoved him so hard that he cut through the crowds effortlessly like an arrow and came to rest near the door. The priest stopped his business of conducting puja and collecting money and began to curse Rangnath with all his heart. The priest's mouth was small, but some very substantial curses came tumbling out brokenly. Very soon the temple resounded with shouts and curses because the pilgrims too began assisting the priests in their abuse of Rangnath. The Ganjahas went out of the temple completely flabbergasted. The priest came to the door of the temple and began to scream, "As soon as I saw your face, I knew it. You're Christian! Spawn of the British. You learn a little bit of their git-bit language and then dare to say that this isn't a goddess? After 4 days, you'll be saying your father is not your father." Sanichar and Jognath could not comprehend exactly what was going on. Still, they flailed around and started to kick up a fuss. By then, Rupan had recovered his ability to handle the situation. He caught hold of Rangnath's hand and said, "Let's go, brother." Then, turning to the priest, he remarked loudly, but in a cool tone, "Look here, Maharaj, don't go smoking too much hash on Mela days. You're getting old and it goes to your head." The priest had opened his mouth to say something, but Rupan stalled him. Enough. Don't try to talk back to me. We belong to Shivpal Ganj. Put your tongue back in its snake hole." After walking for some time, Rangnath said, "I was wrong. I shouldn't have said anything." Rupan Babu consoled him. "You're right, but it's not really your fault. It's the fault of your education."
The other novel you've translated is Reza's Adha Gao, A Village Divided, which is also a modern classic and a very, very different kind of work. I think it's deeply lyrical. There's a sort of sense of melancholy about it. So the mood is very, very different from this. So could you tell us a little bit about how and why and what were the challenges and the process?
I think the challenges for me were that this particular author, Rahi Raza, who people may know most generally in India for his work in the Hindi film industry and later in his career, and his writing the dialogues for B.R. Chopra's Mahabharat. He unfortunately died very shortly after we signed the contract, and nobody could tell me what a lot of these words, which were peculiar to the village, meant. And his sisters knew Urdu. The book was originally written in Urdu, but the publishers said it was too serious, and so the Urdu publishers, and so it was then rewritten in Hindi. So his family his sisters had never read it. And so I had to read out the Hindi to them to try and find out what some of the words were, and to familiarize yourself with the Bhojpuri. Also, it is a universal sort of book. It's a true book. It deals with big international things like the Second World War, the 42 Quit India movement, partition, the spreading of hatred into villages before partition, and finally the coup de grace for all the zamindars was the abolition of zamindari in the 1950s. So it has, but it's seen in from the aspect of a single place, a single village. And that village is, and one particular family who are Sayyid Shia Zamindars in that village with a particular culture. So in order to understand that culture, I had to leave the city, go to the Kasbah, spend time during Muharram, which is the key festival of not only for the Shias, but also for their hangers-on for the various castes around them. It's celebrated by all castes in the villages of North India and all communities. And to understand what was a soz, what was a salam, what was a marsiya. And that, I think, changed my life, because to this day, I go back to a kasbah in Raebareli district and I recite marsiya from the mimbar in the family majlis. So it enriched my life greatly, I have to say.
That, and then please read.
Oh, just read, yeah. Well, I'm going to read you a short piece which relates to the 42 Quit India movement. Now, we may think that, in fact, we know that police corruption didn't begin in 1947. Police corruption and brutality existed in India during the days of the British Raj, and I think one of the most wonderful accounts of this is in something called the Bajpur Chronicles, which was actually written in the 19th century, and which is a satire written by a Britisher on the local administration in the districts. So the Thanedar is a chap called Thakur Harnarayan Singh. His Havildar is a Muslim called Samiuddin. And Samiuddin has a son who goes to the Second World War and comes back, and he wants to arrange his marriage, which he does. And he doesn't tell the girl that is going to marry him that the boy has come back only with one leg. And the second, I would just like to give an example of the second character mentioned here in a big way, as a chap called Funnan Miya. Now, Funnan Miya is the sort of, somebody has said about the small towns and the villages that basically the smaller habitat, the bigger the life, the larger the life characters you get. Funnan Miya is the sort of chap who is barely literate, but can tell if a rag is slightly off key, will know miles and miles of poetry, especially the poetry of Muharram. He is brilliant with a lati. He is a wrestler. He has lots of chelas. He's the sort of chap who climbs over the mud wall of his neighbor's house, carries off his wife, who is 8 months pregnant and who he adores, brings up his his neighbor's child as his own, and has several more children with this woman who loves him. And this man whose wife he has carried off, he still sits with him and smokes the hookah as if they're the best of friends. He's that sort of chap. Anyway, let me find the bit where it starts on the evening when the announcement has gone out that the Congress leaders have been arrested, Quit India has begun. And as the wedding procession of Samiuddin's son, Moinuddin, returns, they hear that there has been a meeting somewhere in a mandir. But the police are unconcerned. They return to the police station where not only the Thanedar lives, but has the lockup and everything. They also have their quarters. So the Thanedar and Samiuddin, both his Havildar, both have their quarters in the police station. Moinuddin sat down on the bed. Badrun, wearing deep red, was lying flat on her back. Her eyes were closed. Her heart was pounding, and tiny beads of sweat on her nostrils were trembling. A strange fragrance rose from her hair, and her clothes were perfumed with attar of wedding night. Glitter sparkled on her brow like a galaxy of stars. Moinuddin saw all this in one glance. Then he took off his wooden leg. He propped it carefully against the wall and bent over Badrun. Open your eyes just once. See what I look like. Badrun heard his voice. She liked it too, but she didn't open her eyes. Her heart began to pound even harder because someone had told her, don't show off too much on the first night. When you give birth, it's so painful, it's killing. And she began to feel a sense of curiosity. How did a boy come into your stomach? But her whole body was as cold as ice, and 7 or 8 days of fasting had robbed her of all her strength to resist. It's possible that girls were made to sit on a charpoy and fast, so that if the bridegroom only had one leg or was ugly, the bride couldn't resist. At least Badrun couldn't. Late that night, when Moinuddin had worn himself out and gone to sleep, Badrun opened her eyes. She was worn out herself. Despite the numbness in her body caused by the fasting, she felt a sweet pain, and yet she opened her eyes. First she looked at Moinuddin's face, and although he was asleep, she blushed. Then she looked at his whole body, bit by bit, but part of his body was leaning against the wall. Seeing the wooden leg, she felt sad. Just at that moment, the constable on duty at the police station fired his first shot. The Bhars from the Bhar settlement and the men of Prithvipal Singh and Ashrafullah Khan had surrounded the Thana. There must have been some 2,000 men. In this crowd, there were few people who knew the slogan, "Quit India." There weren't even people among them who knew what freedom meant. These were the people from whom 1.5 the amount of land revenue had been taken, from whose fields the grain had been seized, who had been forced to contribute to the war fund, whose brothers and nephews had been killed or were about to be killed in the war, and from whom the police of Qasimabad had been extracting bribes for generations. The largest group among them belonged to Funnan Mian, although Funnan Mian wasn't there himself. Leading Funnan's group was Harpal Singh, grandson of his friend Kanvarpal Singh and eldest son of Prithvipal Singh, and standing shoulder to shoulder with him was Jinguria. The crowd's demand was that the Thanedar, Thakur Har Narayan Prasad, be handed over to them. It's obvious that this was impossible. The Thakur Sahib barricaded himself in, and it was he who fired the first shot, the shot which killed Harpal Singh. Govardhan was also killed in the first round of firing, as was Mumtaz, Funnan Mian's son, who had celebrated his 15th birthday just a few days earlier. Funnan Mian didn't know that he was among the attackers, or perhaps he would have stopped him. Or perhaps he would have recalled some verses of a Marsiya, which described Imam Hussein at Karbala fastening a sword around the waist of his 18-year-old son Ali Akbar, or his 13-year-old son Qasim. And if he had recalled such a verse, it's very likely he would have recited it softly and given Mumtaz permission to go and not told his mother. When the crowd saw these 3 corpses, it turned mad. The police station was overrun. The Thakur Sahib and all his constables were tied to a tree and burnt to death, and their quarters were set on fire. There was no noise from any of the quarters except that of Samiuddin and his son. For a long time, the sound of women's screams came from there.
I think Gillian has also translated Bhisham Sahni, another very important Hindi writer.
But unfortunately, I never translated Thomas. Somebody else did that. So I did his short stories, which are also wonderful. But his great novel, which is a classic as these 3, somebody else did. So I can't really talk about that. That, of course, was a novel of partition.
I think we are almost out of... Do we have time for 1 or 2 questions? Okay,
One question, if there
one.
is anyone.
My question is that when you're working with the text and translation, you're not only translating the words, but the culture also. So I just wanted to know, as someone who hails from a different culture, was it a conscious attempt for you to translate the Indianness along with the words? Did you employ Indian words or a certain turn of phrase in a dialogue? What was your tool, if at all you used one?
I think actually these are things which are developing. And I think one of the great things about English in India is that when I started translating, people were very careful about using Indian words in English. And I think that's gone. English is now Indian fully, and you can make it as elastic as you want to be. And you can really challenge readers. And especially as most translations done in India, published in India, are for an Indian audience. I don't think we need to be at all wary of that. In this particular book, it was incredibly attacked at the time because it used what you can sort of call galis, okay? It used the M word, the B word, because in that Bhojpuri idiom, that's what people use without even thinking about it. And I just left that as it was. And a lot of the elasticity of language, the colorfulness of language, you don't really need to look for equivalent. You can really get the taste of it by just keeping to that. And I think that neither of these books, nothing I have done, but particularly books which are rooted in a particular place, unless you have the idea of the culture, unless you attempt to try and understand and see things rather than translate just words, I think you will fail. But I think it's something which is changing. And every time I look at these books which I have published, I think if I did it now, I would do it differently. Because the thing about translation also, you have to at some point hand it over and give it to a publisher. But it's like many things in life. When you're writing stuff, you can always do it differently. And there is no end, basically. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists.
And thank you for being a wonderful audience. This is my first time in this Lit Fest, and I am so impressed by all the audiences here. You've been wonderful for everyone, I think. Thank you.